Good morning, and after a break last month, welcome back to OAG's latest webinar. It's great to see so many of you registered today. I'd like to think that you've been missing our insights that you get from John and our guests each month. If that's so, I hope there's plenty for you here today. I'm Becca Rowland, and I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. Somewhat inevitably, we're going to be asking, where does the industry go next? What should we be expecting for the next 6 months? We've now experienced 2 successive lackluster summer seasons. The months between June and August used to be when air travel peaked and airlines made their money. And we've remarked before at how there have been relatively few airline failures, but how much longer can this continue? We know that demand remains soft, so what should we expect now? We're going to be looking at a lot of OAG data today, as well as some data from elsewhere, and trying to draw out some of the insights to help us understand what's happening in the market and what we can expect going forward. If you've signed up and registered for this, you will get the webinar, link to the webinar afterwards, so you can have a look at it again. And please do ask questions as we go along. We try to get to some questions at the end, but often our discussions being far-reaching and rambling and wide-ranging and all of those things through the next hour. And we try to take your questions as we go through. So if we've got questions, time for questions at the end, we'll take those as well. But do submit your questions as we go through. As always, we've got John Grant, OAG's Chief Analyst, with us today. John's never short of a few things to say about the industry. Welcome back, John. You've not had much of a summer, have you, I think?
No, carried on working through it, Becca. I have so missed you in these webinars, Becca, so it's great to be back.
I was thinking more in terms of getting a break and a holiday. I think, like many of us, you've just been at home all summer. So yeah, not much travelling for the airlines there.
I missed out on my personal invite from President Biden to go to the United States. So like most of the UK market, it's been a staycation for me. I can't wait to go overseas again.
Hopefully you'll get away soon. And it's lovely to have Gary Bowerman back with us. Gary is Director of Check-in Asia. You joined us in July. So just quite recently, Gary, but with so much going on in Asia Pacific, we thought it'd be great to have you back today to unpack some of the issues that are affecting air travel there. I gather today in Kuala Lumpur, it's lashing with rain, you say?
It's lashing with rain, yeah. Thanks for having me back, Becca, and hi to you, John, as well. Yeah, it's an interesting period, actually, at Southeast Asia. We can unpack some of these issues as we go forward. We've had a pretty interesting summer in Malaysia, but finally, we haven't been able to travel here domestically even since January. But finally, that deadlock is going to be broken this week, so there's plenty to talk about. So yeah, let's get cracking. That's
really good. Great. Well, good to have both of you here today. Let's start with where we are in the world, the state of recovery. We've split out China from the rest of Asia, which is something I know that many of you who listen to these webinars regularly ask us about. Can we see China separately? China here, as of this week, makes up about 20% of global capacity. So it's a very sizable chunk of aviation at the moment. John, do you want to talk us through first what we're seeing here? There's some really distinct trends, aren't there, when we look at this? This is the last year of airline capacity.
Sure, Becca. So for me, I think the really outstanding and stark line is that just purely for China, where you can see how dramatic and how quickly the Chinese authorities moved to cut capacity when they feared further outbreaks of COVID-19 in February and again in August. Literally wiping millions of seats out of the domestic market at a week's notice, and how quickly they put those seats back in. So I think that might actually be a pattern we could begin to see in other country markets as we go through this. And in fact, we have seen it in India, for example, and in Indonesia as well. So China stands out. Another one that sadly stands out for all the wrong reasons is Southwest Pacific, where since June we've seen dramatic capacity reductions, particularly in Australia. The bubble burst across the Tasman, I always thought it would do. It was, you know, it was a great story, but it really wasn't a realistic solution. And at last, finally, there seems to be some acceptance in Australia, at least, that you can't live in a zero COVID world, and that has to be positive. But getting 70% of their population vaccinated, which is a key milestone for them, is, you know, the next step forward, and hopefully we might actually see some international flights to selected safe markets from Australia by the year end. And the other one, of course, is looking at Europe, where and the United Kingdom certainly isn't part of Europe when we look at the recovery that's been taking place. A dramatic and a significant recovery in capacity from May through to the end of August, driven, of course, by the summer holiday season, the relaxation of travel restrictions between European markets. And even though there has been that dramatic recovery, we're still, you know, 30% less capacity than we would normally see compared to 2019. So markets are moving in different directions at different speeds. There are some positives out there, some little bits of hope, glimmers of recovery, but for each and every one of those, I'm afraid, you know, the winter, and certainly through probably until April 2020, does not look good for the airline industry. The capacity is not as high as anyone expected by the year end, and the demand is lagging 15-20 percentage points behind that capacity, and the business traveller is not returning at the moment. So it's a very stark couple of months that we're going to face before anything gets better, I suspect.
Gary, do you have anything to add to that, particularly for Asia and Southwest Pacific?
Yeah, I think John highlighted two pretty important markets there. China, for sure. You know, you look at that V-shaped dip and then slight recovery. The problem at the moment, there's another outbreak in Fujian province and the cities of Xiamen and Putian, which is causing grave concerns because there are two big holidays coming up for China. Next week is the long weekend Mid-Autumn Festival holiday. And then at the beginning of October, which is the big Golden Week travel period, is the National Day holiday week right at the start of October. So I was reading today Chinese state media, and at the moment the advice is slightly uncertain about whether people should travel for Mid-Autumn Festival. They don't really want to dampen sentiment, but they are acting very quickly, as John said, to try and shut down these two outbreaks. But they are of concern. You can tell by the use of language in Chinese media, they are worried about these two outbreaks. So, you know, that's something to watch. Australia, I totally agree with John. I think there are signs that there is fevered speculation that there will be some activity towards the end of the year. Vaccination rates are increasing quite well there. New South Wales state said today that they've actually reached 80% in terms of the first dose. But the problem with Australia at the moment is just this, what's called the fractured federation, is that the states are going in different directions. They have different policies towards each other. They may even have different policies towards international travel. So, you know, whether Australia will open up as one market or whether it be on a state-by-state basis, we don't know right now. But I think it's forecast that there would be about a 6-week window between the first state and the final state reaching what John said, that 80% double dose rate, which is going to hopefully change everything. So, you know, there's going to be an interim period, and some states won't want to wait. Some may want to wait a bit longer. So, as a national market, it's a little bit difficult to foresee right now.
And I guess what we're seeing in the European curve here is actually the different. It's not states within a country, but different states within Europe. They finally got to a point in sort of May, June, where they could permit travel between each other, and we saw air travel just take off quite rapidly, didn't we?
Yeah, I think, I mean, going back to Australia, you know, this is all a ploy to stop English cricket fans getting there to see England win the Ashes. You know, but more seriously, the damage to their economy, not just from English tourists drinking cans of Foster's on the beach, but from Chinese students and all of the other valuable revenue sources they have, will hit them not just this year, but will ripple out for the next 18 months if they can't move quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Someone
mean,
asked about,
we talk about winter, John, but you know, at the end of the year is peak season for Australia. It's the Ashes is there. They also have the Australian Open tennis tournament. But you know, travel to Australia during that period is when they try to maximize everything they can in an ordinary year.
We've had a question
someone
about
asked,
Africa and Middle East.
yeah.
I was going to say with Africa, I mean, obviously with both of these regions, we're seeing a sort of a gradual, steady increase in traffic. But I think in Africa, it's still largely domestic, isn't it? I think we've seen Nigeria do really well, but other places, it's just a bit more tentative. So I think we've got a number later on in the set of the slide deck that looks at Nigeria and just how well that's been doing domestically. So I suspect if we were to break Africa down, some of that is Nigeria, some of it's Egypt, South Africa, which is the biggest market, still having lots of issues. And the Middle East, what's driving the steady growth there, John? Is that the hubs opening up now, or is that regional traffic?
It is a bit of a hub activity. I mean, Emirates have restored services to the United Kingdom in the last couple of weeks, and that's added more capacity. And there's been some more low-cost activity coming in and out of the Middle East. So that's driving the growth there. But the problem for the Middle East, and particularly the hub carriers, is in that line right at the bottom, Southwest Pacific, because a large proportion of the Middle East market is predicated on Sixth Freedom connecting traffic from Europe into Southeast Asia, which is still, underperforming, and into Australia and New Zealand, and they just cannot operate, and it's restricting capacity. It's frustrating the recovery, and of course, until very recently, the United Arab Emirates was on the red list for travel to the United Kingdom. It's now an amber list country. Hopefully this week we'll get rid of the traffic lights. Probably we can get someone to nick them overnight from a set of roadworks. There's plenty around in the UK.
We know that you're no fan
so
of the
it's
system.
no fan at all. It makes no sense. It's a crazy policy, and it's a silly idea. Better ways to manage.
Let's move on, because we've got many more slides to get through and lots more information. This is looking back over the last 12 weeks, just seeing how capacity has changed, or where it is versus the same week in 2019. I wish we weren't still referencing 2019, but I think we're going to be doing that for a little bit longer to try and keep making sense of where we are. And this is useful because we see, especially for China here, this big dip that we just saw in the chart a moment ago, where they were 6% above 2019 for capacity at the end of July, and 2 weeks later we're minus 35% down. Amazing, really, that they can pull out that much capacity at such short notice. And then, as you said, John, within a matter of weeks, they're back up where they were. Very swift movement, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is that completely controlled market, isn't it? And we may touch on it later, but Gary, I think that the real danger for not just China, but for certainly Southeast Asia, the near regional markets, and perhaps even further afield is, will China ever open up back for international services? Do they want to reconnect with the world? You know, you hear so much negative sentiment about access and international acceptance. What's your thinking? Is it going to take longer than anyone expected for China to reopen?
Probably, yeah, I do. I think China does want to reconnect. I think there is definitely the sentiment, particularly to make connections with Southeast Asia. The foreign minister was touring around Southeast Asia this last week, didn't really talk too much about aviation or travel. This one was pretty much about strategic and trade relations. But, you know, China does see Southeast Asia as very, very vital for a number of reasons. So, you know, there is that willingness to happen, but it is the ultimate COVID zero country. You know, it does really, and it has done since the outbreak, since it controlled the original outbreak, it has jumped on absolutely every outbreak as quickly as it can to suppress and get down to zero. I do think that next year it will change its strategy slightly, but you know, we discussed this on the last webinar, whether that will be this year or whether that's going to be after the Beijing Winter Olympics, you'd have to say it's going to be next year at some point.
So I was talking with somebody last week about because the Chinese outbound market has been such an important and large part of international travel over the last few years, and we've certainly talked about it a lot. That means that idea of Chinese opening up gives China a lot of soft power here, and that they're not going to open up to everywhere at once. And so choosing which markets open first will be not just a matter of demand, but also there'll be a lot of politics involved. Are you able to comment a bit on that, Gary, about how the politics of which countries open up will sort of meet the issues of demand and where people want to travel?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's very difficult, and always has been, to second guess Chinese strategic politics. It's quite clear where it sees its interests, and that's Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. This region is very, very important to it. But it doesn't have the same level of relations with different countries. For example, it doesn't have great relations with Vietnam, which you would imagine a lot of its travelers would like to visit in the future. Australia, you look at travel sentiment surveys across Asia, not just in China, over the past 12, 18 months. And Australia will be a very coveted destination, New Zealand as well. When borders do reopen, would China allow its travelers to visit Australia? At the moment, that's unknown. Japan also would be a very, very important destination for Chinese travelers. They love Japan, everything about it, particularly the cuisines. How will it reopen? Yeah, I think it's almost not worth speculating. China does have this new railway that it's opening up at the end of this year with Laos. Laos is a neighboring nation, has had COVID-19 pretty much under control. It uses mostly Chinese vaccines. So you'd think that Laos might be a forerunner. But again, that would be part of other negotiations throughout the region. I think at the current stage, we probably have to accept that we've got to get through the Beijing Olympics and then watch China's reaction after that. I do think it will change its policy, but you're right, it won't open up en masse. There will be selective and pilot reopenings, I would imagine. So I think we just have to watch and wait and see.
And thanks very much, Gary. I guess the last thing to say on this slide is overall, this week, we're 29% below where we were in 2019. So that does mark steady improvement, doesn't it? We are still, in a sense, continuing on an upward journey. Okay,
I think you're fine. I think you're looking very hard to find those moments of optimism.
I probably am.
Long way to go.
This is quite a busy chart, but we've got lots of countries here, and we show where we are in terms of domestic versus international capacity versus the same week 2019. We had a question in about North America. Somebody was specifically asking about the US. So here we are, domestic US down 11%, international down 40%. So this is a pattern we're seeing, across the board. The international still struggling much more than domestic. Though, as Gary's spoken about, in Malaysia, you've not been able to travel domestically since the beginning of the year. And this is, a lot of, domestic capacity is still a long way off where it is in many other countries. But we see Nigeria here doing quite well, Tunisia doing quite well, Russia doing quite well in terms of domestic travel, in addition to China and Korea, which we knew about. So lots of interesting patterns there. But Asia Pacific, this is the region, isn't it, where capacity is still a long way behind 2019.
It's dire. I mean, if you took India out of that table, the rest are, particularly in an international perspective, are way down. And to Gary's earlier point, Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia, so reliant on Chinese connectivity for a lot of their international capacity, and therefore unlikely to see that move in the next 6-7 months at the very least.
Okay, let's
I would agree. You referenced there Malaysia. I'll just get this point in, Becca, very quickly. But yeah, we haven't been able to travel domestically for the last 8 months. But the island of Langkawi is being opened up as a pilot reopening tomorrow. Tomorrow is Malaysia Day, national holiday. So it's going to be open for domestic vaccinated travelers. So we will see some a bit of a boost in domestic capacity, I think, over the next few weeks. it's uncertain how that will then be extrapolated with other openings across the Malay Peninsula and into East Malaysia. We don't quite know at the moment how that will happen, but I think by October, November, we'll see more domestic destinations open. So the domestic sector, I think, will rebound. You know, Malaysians love to travel. The airlines here are chomping at the bit to increase their capacity. So I think we'll see some domestic travel here in the next couple of months for sure.
But Gary, it's an interesting point. I mean, consumers are desperate to travel. We see that every time the market reopens, that pent-up demand floods through. But what about the supply and the infrastructure? Is that still there? You know, I mean, these places have been closed for so long. We're hearing in Australia that the Airline Association is pleading, the airlines and the airports are pleading with the government for clarity about reopening, because they've got to start resourcing facilities that have been wound down. What's it like in Malaysia? Is there a tourism product to go to?
Yeah, it's a good question. Clinging on, I would say, is the, you know, very similar to Langkawi, is very similar to Bali, is very similar to Phuket. You know, a lot of businesses have closed. There's no question about that. You know, small hotels, small restaurants, a lot of businesses that support the travel industry have gone. And, you know, they will come back in time. New investors will probably take those over. At the moment in Langkawi, it does seem a lot of the bigger resorts, there aren't a huge amount of resorts on Langkawi, but they're a significant number. I think most of those are still able to reopen. I think primarily because they were promised that Langkawi would be the first destination to reopen. Malaysians, particularly from KL where I am, you know, KL is the main sort of supply source to Langkawi. And you talk to people here and, you know, people are booking, people want to go. The airlines were offering great deals. The hotels were offering great deals. So you will see movement. But yeah, you're right. There will be closures. There will be infrastructure that that existed even 7 or 8 months ago, which is not there now. But, you know, the rebound will take time. I think we just have to accept that, but it will come back over time.
John, I thought the point you made about Australia is well made as well, that, you know, airlines are going to be, the foreign airlines that would normally fly to Australia will obviously be looking now at where they're going to place aircraft next summer. And Australia, for many of them, is a long way. And if there's no certainty about Australia being open, does that mean that some of those airlines that we might expect normally to fly to Australia will just say they're not on the schedule for next summer?
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, Becca, you know, airlines would be maximising their capacity and utilising their aircraft as efficiently as they possibly can. But that isn't the situation at the moment. So I think if there is any positive sort of messaging that comes out of Australia, many of the major carriers will be able to ramp up capacity in a very, very short period of time. You know, they've all got, the Middle East carriers have all got capacity coming out their ears. They don't know what to do with. And recently, I know Singapore Airlines have been moving some A380s, firing the engines back up and seeing how much dust comes out the back of them. You know, and all of those sort of things. So airlines are cautiously and quietly doing things around the touch lines of their businesses to be ready, not just for Australia, but other markets that recover. And even British Airways have been flying some A380s around recently. So I don't think that is the problem. It is just the whole thing about confidence. And, you know, the sooner there is definite statements from any government, not just the Australians, about reopening, then the more opportunity and the more comfortable airlines will be about relaunching services. Who doesn't want to go to Australia?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. I think there are sort of two speeds in Asia Pacific at the moment. You look at countries like Singapore is a great example. You know, Singapore is really looking to regenerate both inbound and outbound travel. South Korea has basically allowed its travelers to travel this summer. A lot of them have gone to Europe, so they would probably travel to Australia. The other side of the coin, though, is that a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, which are suppliers of travelers to Australia, currently are looking at tourism as an inbound only reopening. So they're looking at ways they can bring tourists into the country. There's no word at the moment, particularly in countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, even Vietnam, how that's going to extrapolate to outbound travel. And obviously that makes it very difficult for airlines because you're only flying people in one direction. And it may be that, you know, travelers from some of these countries may still have to do a quarantine when they return if they were able to go to Australia, which is the massive disincentive. So You know, there's these two speeds at the moment, and Australia will have that same problem that, you know, kind of Phuket has had, really. You can open up, and that's okay to do, but if the demand isn't there, if countries actually aren't allowing their travelers to visit your destination, there's very little you can do.
There's an interesting, Timothy O'Neill Dunn has just put a stat up about, he had a colleague, well, probably actually it's more of an acquaintance, Timothy, than a colleague. But anyway, flying Sydney, Singapore on SQ, and there were 24 passengers on the flight. Now, quite frankly, that was a very good load, I would think, for any airline at the moment because of the restrictions to get in and out of Australia. But the yields these people are paying to be on these flights is phenomenal. I mean, some of the fares that Qatar and Emirates and Etihad have been picking up, and how they're pricing at the moment is literally based on hiring a private jet. I mean, their airfares and yields are 10, 12 times higher than normal rates because they've got to try and make a bit of revenue out of this, and the demand is there for people desperate to go in one direction or the other.
Okay, let's move on because we've got many more slides to get through, I'm afraid, so I'm going to have to speed you guys up a bit. We just put a slide in here with a snapshot of some of the news over the summer, some of the things that have been happening with airlines, aircraft, governments. Anything here that is of particular interest, John? What about the airlines requiring crews to be vaccinated? Is that an issue for the airlines? We've seen a bit of that.
I don't think it is. I've seen a story overnight that you may recall Delta Airlines insisted that their employees were double vaccinated or would have to pay or would be deducted $200 a month for insurance purposes. Step forward 4,000 Delta employees to be vaccinated in a week. So I don't think it is an issue. It is as much a duty of care from the airline's perspective to protect their staff from being exposed to further outbreaks of COVID-19. And it's going to be a requirement if you want to travel around the world. If you want to travel almost anywhere in Europe, you have to have proof of being double vaccinated. And if it will be a matter of the haves and the have-nots, absolutely. And it will be personal choice. But if people want to fly, then I think it's inevitable. And, the sooner we all get our heads around that and understand that's the new world order, the better for everyone, because governments will then be more comfortable with allowing travel. I think the big things are in the aircraft orders. Airlines will continue to be extremely confident about the future. Ryanair break off talks with Boeing because Boeing have a very strong perspective of aircraft values in the next couple of years, which suggests they think the market's going to recover. Jet2 order 36 aircraft. Airlines, despite everything we've said, Becca, airlines are confident about the medium to long-term future, and the market sentiment is probably that way inclined as well, which makes some of the current valuations of airlines in the UK marketplace, where investment communities are talking down the share prices, just seems counterintuitive to the long-term value. I mean, I'm not a shareholder, but the prices of some of the airline stocks at the moment, there's got to be more upside than downside.
Yeah, I was looking at the Boeing and Airbus orders this year. I guess it's not something I look at on a regular basis, but was quite surprised at how many aircraft have been ordered this year. I mean, obviously for some airlines it's a good time, isn't it? There's a lot of perhaps an easier negotiating job at this particular point in time to be able to order new aircraft. But as you say, yeah, there's a lot of scope for growth out there, but it's a bit further down the line, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a chart here, a bit busy. We showed something a little bit like this back in July, but it just had one dot for each of these countries. And what we've done is revisited it and shown where each country has moved over the summer. So for each country, you've got a dot that is from the 15th of July and then updated for this week's schedule. And along the bottom axis here, you've got how far below the 2019 capacity, international capacity they are, or in the case of Mexico, above the international capacity. and on this vertical axis, the proportion of the population with at least one dose. And we just thought it was really interesting because it shows that it isn't an inevitability that as the population gets vaccinated, there's more international travel. Obviously, we're seeing that in many markets: Turkey, Greece, Mexico, Russia, a lot of Europe here, and the USA. But we've got this cluster of countries, which again is what you've been talking about, Gary, isn't it? The Asian countries, the Southwest Pacific countries, where there just isn't a link at the moment between vaccination and international travel. This is our zero case policy countries, where they're making decisions based on different criteria.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think China stands apart from that. I mean, China's vaccination rate is, I mean, you know, it's more than 1.4 billion doses, I think, that they've delivered. But it's a very, very different scenario. If you look at those other countries there, you know, the vaccination rates are increasing quite fast in Malaysia. They're increasing quite fast in Australia. South Korea and Japan, you know, they're moving along. The problem with countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, particularly Indonesia, it's just such a huge population. That's 272 million people. Vietnam is almost 100 million people. So it's to reach these thresholds, which countries are setting themselves, 70% or 80% in terms before they will allow travel again. That's a very high threshold to meet. So Indonesia is saying, you know, it's looking at about 80% of 272 million people just to get the first dose, and then it might allow some travel. But that, you know, that takes time. It's a difficult process. And as we mentioned before in the webinar, Becca and John, you know, those countries are so important to each other. And if any of those aren't, or as of the moment, none of those are really operating much travel, you know, that really affects the performance of each country.
Yeah. Okay, we've got some data now that's come from, we've borrowed from Bloomberg. They produced a resilience ranking of countries. And at the beginning of the summer, they added in some aviation elements. So they've got a flight capacity metric in their ranking, or in their the model that comes up with this ranking or indicator, and they've got a vaccinated travel routes metric. And it's quite interesting because it shows that just how much churn there is. I think they're producing this every month now. Netherlands are doing really well, moved up 12 places. And we're going to be having this afternoon with the webinar we do, we've got Wilco Svegen from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. So that'll be interesting if anybody wants a double dose of webinars today. But then we see New Zealand moving, it's been #1 in this ranking for quite a long time and now just moved down to 26. So one of the things Bloomberg are saying is just, it's not easy to know and be consistent about what makes for resilience, that it keeps changing under these COVID situations, and the Delta variant has really changed things for many countries.
Yeah.
John, is there anything you want to add there?
Well, the whole issue of churn is just so important. I mean, it is, you know, reading the tea leaves, understanding what's going to happen in the future is almost like pinning a tail on a donkey. You just, so many variables are at play here, and data is not consistent in terms of what authorities are publishing it and what other governments are using, what sources for making their judgments on opening or closing borders. And it makes it really, it just highlights how difficult it is for a consumer to work their way through this minefield of information and decide if they're going to risk traveling or not. And if you look at some airlines, I was looking at some airline schedules data, you know, the volatility in the market at the moment, how frequently airlines are changing schedules, probably 8 to 10 times more frequently than they were 2 years ago, just to take account of all of the data you see on this slide, which I think is really useful. Shout out to Chris Jasper from Bloomberg, who's on the webinar, for putting this together with his team. They probably owe me a beer, but there you go.
Okay, that's interesting. We're now looking at where airlines are. Again, we're still looking at capacity as a proportion of 2019. I know many of you will be saying, oh, but it's traffic that really counts. But obviously the capacity data is much more timely. There's a bit of a time lag with the traffic data. We know that traffic is lagging behind capacity, but in terms of where airlines are, where countries are relative to one another, it's still giving us valuable insights. So we put a whole range of airlines on a line here, just showing where capacity is relative to 2019 for August. We've got Wizz in Europe right up at the top, offering more capacity than they did 2 years ago. And we've got Qantas, Cathay, BA, Singapore down at the other end of the spectrum. So quite a mix here, isn't it, John? I mean, it does reflect what we've been talking about with the different countries, really.
Completely. And, you know, all of those that are to the left of that line are what we would probably term historically as classic legacy carriers, with large proportions of Sixth Freedom traffic, connecting traffic that just for whatever reason isn't back again, and they are stranded. And until those countries reopen completely, they will remain stranded. And it's a tragedy to see iconic carriers like Qantas, Cathay, Singapore, British Airways in that horrible position. And yet at the other end, you have, you know, the upstarts, the nimble fleet of foot, Wizz Airs, Southwest, Ryanairs, who low-cost carriers, Indigo, who are able to restart their networks very quickly, are opportunistic in what they're flying, opportunistic in who they may want to try and take over. So it's certainly a two-speed airline recovery we are seeing, clearly in many ways driven by market circumstances and regulatory policies they have to live with or without.
I know we're going to come on to, I think with the next slide, just a little bit about maybe I'll move on to that now. Consolidation. We saw on that last slide EasyJet and Wizz. We know that there was an offer made. Was it last week, John? For Wizz was looking to take over EasyJet. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? What is it that EasyJet? Why have they got themselves in that situation? Why might they be attractive to be taken over? And will we see more of that with other airlines?
Well, I mean, I think we're probably all very surprised that 18, 20 months into this whole event, we've seen very little consolidation or establishment of strategic partnerships aside from Korean and ASEANA. But, you know, as we come out of this, I suspect we may see more. EasyJet's position, as we showed in the last slide, is that they're lagging behind their competitors in terms of a recovery. You know, they have been unfortunately hampered by having a very large share of the UK market, and because of that, the travel restrictions that have been in place here but not in Europe have meant that they've lost pace and they've slipped further behind Wizz and Ryanair and even Vueling. So they've got a longer journey to recover. I understand that, and you know, UBS downgraded and commented upon that for EasyJet last week, and they're right, but the long-term sentiment is still good. Why would anyone even make an approach for EasyJet? Well, we don't know it was Wizz Air. We all speculate it was Wizz Air. We haven't had confirmation, and I don't think you will get official confirmation on that front. But once the recovery gets underway in the United Kingdom, and hopefully it will do over the winter and more so into summer 22, EasyJet have at the moment about a 40% share of slots at London Gatwick, an airport that you know, will bounce back very strongly in the recovery, serving the point-to-point market, and for Wizz Air, access to London's second largest airport that has a very large point-to-point leisure and business market into Europe, would have been nearly at any price a really valuable strategic acquisition. And you know, if the price was right, then it probably would have been a very interesting deal. Similar fleet types, Wizz Air with a much lower cost base. The challenge for EasyJet is, I think, they're in danger of becoming not a pure low-cost airline, but a mid-market airline. And from my own experiences, if you're a mid-market airline, it's very hard to create a space for yourself. So, you know, perhaps that's why EasyJet have this obsession with cost at the moment. Peter Bellew is in there, who was at Malaysia Airlines and very briefly at Ryanair, Chief Operating Officer. He's tasked with bringing unit costs down. They have a new chairman, you know, so that's why it was happening. But if you look at these numbers here, Becca, there are too many airlines, scheduled airlines in the world for some of these regional markets. Does Western Europe need 116 scheduled airlines even today? No, it probably
It's
doesn't.
a lot of airlines, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a crazy amount for, and indeed I saw posted somewhere last week, which I thought was an interesting thought. Does Europe have too many airports?
Yeah.
Particularly in
I
the
know,
context.
John, you and I did a piece of work many years ago now looking at, I think it was the power of three, and the way in many different sectors markets often work towards three major players, perhaps at a geographic level or even globally. And I know we've got three major airline alliances. And we looked at, I think it was beer industry and I don't know, all sorts of things, didn't we? But
yeah,
you look at that, 116 airlines in Western Europe, there aren't many sectors that have that many companies competing for the same business, really.
No, and you know, you don't have 116 companies in any other public transportation sector. So partly this is, of course, historic, Becca. It's driven by government ownership rules, regulatory pressures, etc., etc. But you have to feel that as we come out of the recovery, the market is going to probably see more consolidation, perhaps more strategic partnerships. But there are some ripe pickings for people out there.
Okay, that's airlines. Let's have a quick look at airports. Some of the busiest airports in the world this week. Amsterdam up at the top. This is for international capacity. Interesting time, isn't it, when Amsterdam is the biggest. And we've got airports in there like Antalya in Turkey and Vienna, and those big hubs sitting further down our list here. This isn't I don't think this is the top 20. I think it's just some of the top airports. So it's a bit of a mix, but you can see that some are suffering much more than others. I guess the Antalya is, they've had a lot of tourist traffic, haven't they, to parts of Turkey from Russia, from parts of Europe. They've done quite well.
Yeah, one of the advantages, as we saw in the Greek islands, which obviously is more fragmented, is, you know, by establishing very early that the market was open and that they were prepared to accept international inbound travel, these places did relatively well. And if you're a CEO of Antalya, you take a picture of this slide right now because you're never going to be in this position again. But it goes to show that for every loser, there has been some airports that have been winners and markets that have been winners.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, we want to look specifically at Singapore, and this is because we had a conversation with Gary before this webinar where he was saying Singapore as an airport is really a barometer for Asia Pacific. What did you mean, Gary, by that?
I think the interesting thing about Singapore, and you referenced it 2 or 3 slides ago, was that there was this sense in August. August was quite an interesting month in Southeast Asia, and that was the time when Singapore announced that it was really going to move away from counting cases to counting vaccinations. And once it reached an 80% threshold, it was then going to accept that COVID-19 is endemic and that it had to replan the way that it thinks about every structure of its society. And, you know, aviation is so important to the Singaporean economy. And it was going to start rethinking how it does that. And it wasn't going to do that straight away. It's going to take a bit of time. And as you mentioned, they've already opened what they call 2 vaccinated travel lanes, one with Germany and one with Brunei, which offers inbound and outbound quarantine-free travel. You know, there are a number of restrictions on that. You have to have a number of PCR tests, and you know there's some bureaucracy that goes with it. But what it does do is it shows a start. Now, I think the reason that Singapore is a barometer is because it's a relatively small country. It's a very connective hub for not just for Southeast Asia, but for Asia Pacific. And the fact that it's a small population, so it was able to hit this 80% threshold quite quickly. It's kind of had a knock-on effect throughout the region. So other countries, including Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, are now saying that they have to shift their own strategies as well and think about COVID-19 in a much more longer-term planning way, a bit like Europe has done, and move away from just counting cases every single day and basing policy on that. So, you know, Singapore is, it's an interesting in the sense that it's leading the region in that, but it isn't really, as you said, vaccinations aren't yet transferring into travel activity. The other problem slightly is that it's being hit with a new wave. So it's the numbers of daily cases are going up there, but so the government, to its credit, is saying that it isn't going to lock back down again. It's going to stick with its policy. So it'll be interesting to watch how that happens over the next couple of months. And also because I think Singapore and Australia have been looking towards doing some kind of travel deal later in the year, once Australia hits its 80% threshold. So you may see some travel flows between those two countries. Singapore has also done vaccine swaps with the UK and with Australia. And if you think logically, you know, Singapore does connect Australia and the UK. So I don't know. My feeling is that Singapore is going to lead Southeast Asia out of this, but it may take time. You know, nothing's going to happen quickly, and we may be looking perhaps even into Q2 next year until it starts to have any real effect. But Singapore is definitely one to watch.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the vaccinated travel lane, which is now in place just from a week or so ago. John was saying earlier, you know, we're going to have to accept vaccine passports, but the vaccinated travel lane includes children, doesn't it? So at the moment in Europe, we're vaccinating adults but not children. So, you know, we've still got this mismatch, haven't we, in policy where, you know, do you, if a child is required to have a vaccine to travel, but that's not the policy in certain countries, then families can't travel. It's still complicated, isn't it? And we just need to have some consistency between countries in terms of how they approach this.
Yeah, and within countries as well. So I mentioned earlier that Malaysia is opening Langkawi tomorrow for vaccinated travelers, but you know, families can travel, and here juniors, young children aren't vaccinated either. So yeah, there is that contradiction, but you know, I think that's going to endure with us for some time. There is a big issues in all parts of the world about vaccinating children. We don't quite know where those are going to go. Australia and New Zealand are talking very much about digital health passports. That is very much part of their planning from the end of this year onwards. So yeah, let's watch this space. But yeah, I mean, restrictions are going to stay in place in this part of the world. It's not going to be as free to travel. It's not going to be buy and fly that it used to be, not for some time yet.
And have we over the summer, you know, has there been any progress in terms of some sort of passport that's recognized between countries, more sort of international agreement on this? It still seems like each country is working their way through this on their own and then negotiating bilaterally. We you know, where are the international organizations that are we would have hoped would put in place some sort of more universal rules about how this happens?
Not in Asia, there isn't, not yet, no. John?
Becca, you know, it's one of the most frustrating aspects of this whole situation, in that people like, be it ICAO, IATA, World Health Organization, whoever, you know, those global leadership groups have not managed to create and get through some sort of universal travel app or passport, and it's very fragmented. People are having to download 3 or 4 different country COVID apps to get through various hurdles before they can travel in some cases. And you know, that is another barrier to travel. We have to get back to simplifying the processes and making it as easy as possible. And there has to be a solution. It's the only way forward.
Okay, we wanted to look at one other market, and this is Russia. We've seen Russian tourism, Russian capacity do pretty well, positive domestically, and it's still down quite a lot internationally, down 43%. But there's some hotspots, and we just thought we'd highlight this because there's been a little bit of, I think you were saying, Gary, to us a couple of days ago, that there are countries that are beginning to think about, can they target the Russian outbound tourist if China isn't going to be open for a while? So this just shows some of those hotspots for Russian international capacity, in particular the Maldives. It's not huge numbers, but up 158% in terms of capacity compared to 2 years ago, and Egypt up 439%. So it's not inevitable, is it, that there is no travel? There are clearly some markets that are able to drive demand.
Yeah, and you know, they have Russian tour operators who are principally creating these markets, you know, have been very quick and fleet of foot to move and buy up capacity and pre-commit to hotel stock in some of these markets, which have given them really great rates in a market where most of these destinations' core source markets were just disappearing, places like Egypt, for example. But it's not, these destinations are all interesting, Becca, but it's also how much capacity is now going from Russia into the Caribbean, and not just to Cuba, where they've always had quite a large presence, but to the Dominican Republic and to other Caribbean islands where Aeroflot and other long-haul carriers have started deploying capacity into those markets, because again, there is capacity and there is demand that they can create. Russia has done very well at picking the right markets for putting capacity in and being able to offer, you know, cheap holidays and change travel patterns.
Yeah, I pulled a route map yesterday for 2 years ago from Russia for international travel and for today, and it was interesting just that the really obvious difference was there was so little capacity now going into Southeast Asia, which is I guess why we're seeing growth in these places that are not Southeast Asia. So very interesting.
I think probably the market to watch in the Russian winter, so particularly sort of December through February, look at Thailand and look at Vietnam, because they both tend to attract Russian tourists in relatively large numbers during those months. Vietnam is reopening Phu Quoc by the end of this year. Thailand probably will be a little bit more open than it is right now and won't just be Phuket. So, you know, that both of those will make a play for the Russian market to try and bring some tourists in during what, you know, is generally December through March, a busy season for them, but they won't have the normal traffic they normally get, but they may be able to get some charter traffic from Russia during those months.
Okay, let's have a quick look at how the schedule is changing and how we looking forward this is. So we've shown this sort of slide before. The thick yellow line is the scheduled global capacity to date, where we've got this vertical line, and then what we're seeing in the schedule going forward to the right of this line at the 13th of September. And the dotted lines are previous snapshots. So back on the 5th of July, how it looked, and then the 2nd of August and the 23rd of August. So we can see that capacity came down quite a bit at the end of July, early August, which was largely the Chinese effect, and then it's been building up. But after the end of September, at the moment, it's looking pretty flat, isn't it, John? Are we going to see it? Yeah, I know that week by week, as we look at this, it typically capacity comes out of the schedule. Are we going to see more of that? So actually, the reality is it's going to dip down here.
Yeah, I think so, Becca. This, you know, we have the seasonal wind down from the Northern Hemisphere and the summer programs into the winter periods. We have the last week of October is, you know, when the schedules change and it's half term for many people in Europe. So there's a bit of a spurt of leisure traffic then, but November is traditionally pretty dead. Business traffic is what keeps November ticking along, and that's not going to be there. The US isn't going to be open. Transatlantic capacity is unlikely to return until after Thanksgiving, if it returns in time for Christmas at all. I think that's still a big doubt. 80 million people still not vaccinated in the US. Rates still climbing. It's not a good story. So that's doubtful. My estimation is that we will only have seen a 15% recovery in global capacity in 2021 versus 2020. And if we were to listen to any of the webinars last year, everyone was hoping that we would see a stronger bounce back in 21, and it just has not materialized. And every time there has been calls for optimism, US domestic market had a strong summer, then the Delta variant hits there, and airline CEOs have been coming out saying it's not been as good as they expected the last month, and next 90 days they expect to see business demand not recover as anticipated. So we're going to see more and more capacity taken out. 17 million seats removed from SAL between now and the end of the year, last Saturday when we ran the latest numbers. So it's airlines are shaving back capacity at quite some rate at the moment, and it's completely understandable.
Yeah, so these are, if we're flat to the end of the year here, this point here about 80, bit over 80 million seats is, by my calculation, is 20% still below 2019 year end. So, yeah, it's getting on for, by then it'll be getting on for 2 years we've been dealing with this, and we'll still be 20% down in capacity. And how much more is traffic down, John? What is it, another 10, 15% below that?
Yeah, well, I think nearer 15 and 20. And of course, Becca, you're only looking to year end here. That's because you're afraid to look into 2022 in the first quarter.
Absolutely.
Where, capacity is not going to be any better. No. And we're going to bumble along at between 79 and 70 million seats on a global basis through to at least April, May of next year, unless there are some breakthrough decisions and global easing of travel restrictions. So this is taking a lot longer than anyone had hoped for.
Yeah, we've got one more slide to have a look at, and if we can have a bit of a chat about this. John, this came out of a little bit of analysis that you were doing, wasn't it? Looking at, for a 2-week period, how much change there was in the schedule. And this was, I think you chose the 2 weeks up to the 5th of September and compared it with the same period 2 years earlier. And what we see is 14 times more schedule change, mostly schedules being reduced and scaled back than there were in the 2 weeks prior to a flight in 2019. Incredible, isn't it, that we're still seeing this much. What it means is airlines are still changing their schedule right up to the last minute, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and this is just a stark reflection of where we are at the moment. In most airlines file their schedules. They have a network plan that runs from season to season, and they may make some slight adjustments depending upon how demand is going, but generally it would be just an extra frequency or an upgrade of aircraft size or something like that. But in a 2-week window before travel compared to 2 years ago, airlines are just changing so many schedules at short notice, and the volumes of file changes that are coming through on a regular basis is phenomenal. And shout out to the ladies and the team in OAG who are handling all of these schedule changes, because their workload is like 7-8 times larger than it was 2 years ago. And it's just stark. And of course, if you then work this through the whole supply chain, it impacts resource planning for airports. It impacts concessionaires and their resource plans and their purchasing of stock. And consumer confidence must, in many markets, just be so fragile when you see these sort of numbers and these amount of schedule changes. It's really, really scary, and it shows how much more stability we've got to build back into the networks and the systems before we can expect any real recovery. I mean, some of these markets are very big markets, and to see China changing 17% of its capacity, yeah, it's all domestic, but it's frustrating. India 8%, Indonesia 10%. These are big numbers.
Very difficult times. It's just always interesting, isn't it? The different ways we can slice and dice this data and just draw out different insights and highlight how this whole crisis is affecting different parts of the supply chain.
And, I mean, it's not an advert, but one of the key takeaways from me was you have to refresh your data nearly every week now. If you're anyone who's using travel data, and you're looking at a data set you only acquired a month ago, then trust me, it's out of date.
Yeah. Very interesting. Well, that's we've just got to 9 o'clock here in the UK. We've got through the various slides we plan to address. We've gone through quite a lot of your questions, so thank you all of you who sent questions in. That was really interesting. Gary, any final thoughts? You've told us a lot of really interesting things about Southeast Asia. Is there any particular takeaways you would want to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think pertaining to John's point there about confidence, I think that's crucial. And I think there has been, I'm a little bit more optimistic than I was 2 months ago when I spoke to you guys. I think governments have changed their mindsets a little bit. It's small and it's incremental, but it's important, and that's on the basis of vaccination. So we will see vaccination rates increase across the region over the coming months, and that's great. So rebuilding confidence, I think, in this region will most likely be through domestic travel. We've had stop-start on domestic travel across the region throughout this year. And if there could be sustained periods of domestic travel, that will help to rebuild confidence. I think international travel is a different kettle of fish. That's quite tricky to predict. But I'm looking towards Australia. I have big hopes for Australia that they will reopen to some degree around about Christmas time. And I think that will be a huge boost for the market. I think it will be a big psychological boost for much of Asia Pacific. And I think it would lead other markets with it. So, my hope is that Australia can not win the Ashes, but they can actually help lead a revival in travel.
That's great. Gary, if you can keep being so positive, we'll have you back on regularly. We need some optimism here. Thank you both, John and Gary. We will be back this afternoon with another webinar, broadly similar to this, but with a bit more focus on Europe and North America, with a guest from Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, which, as you've just seen, was the busiest international airport this week. And we'll also be back with the next webinars on the 20th of October. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you then.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becca.